How do you remember more of what you read? Whether that's reading novels like the classics or it's non-fiction, whether you're in university or reading for your own edification, growth, entertainment. In this video, I'm going to share with you 5 pieces of advice that will not only help you remember more of what you read, but will help you to extract more from what you read and to be able to think and speak about more intelligently those things you've read. I'll also share with you the number 1 trap that causes people to fail in these regards. So, without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? So we need to start with talking about that biggest pitfall that people fall into, which prevents them getting the most out of these 5 pieces of advice. And it's really simple, yet 80% of you watching will be tempted to fall into this trap. And that is, you'll hear the tip and then skip in the video to the next tip without listening to the brief explanation between. That is a catastrophic intellectual mistake. I'll put it this way. Imagine you, for the first time, went panning for gold in a river, and you went somewhere and you're panning away and you found a little flake of gold. You'd be very excited, and maybe you would move around the river and you'd try again. Now imagine if you kept finding little pieces of gold. That would be remarkable. But if a geologist came along and thought, do you know what, if the gold is that readily available here in the river, it must be coming from quite a rich source. And so the geologist with their knowledge goes and finds where the vein of gold is. Who's now in the better position? Of course, the geologist. Now, are you a panner of gold or are you an intellectual geologist? It's not enough to know the tip. That's just a fleck of gold. Understanding why the advice works, that is the gold vein. And that's what I want to give you. I'm going to make these points quite short, so it shouldn't be a task to listen through it. My job is to try and make it as easy to listen to as possible. That being said, let's get into these 5 bits of advice that will help you to remember more of what you read and think more intelligently about it. The first piece of advice is extraordinarily powerful, and it's actually advice you will have heard many times before and yet may not have taken the leap to do it. In fact, most people still don't do this. And it's all to do with having a conversation with the author of the book you're reading. Imagine how much more beneficial that would be. Imagine listening to someone give a talk whilst you're jogging or driving, it's on an audiobook, or sitting down with that expert and having a one-to-one conversation with them over coffee where you can ask questions, where you can even put in your own comments, which embeds the experience for you. What am I talking about? Annotation. All you need is an old book, a cheap book, or a crusty old one like this that I found, and a cheap pen. And you start taking notes in the book as you go along. Now, why is this important? This is where a lot will now skip on. But if you want real gold, stick with me. The word annotation traces its root back to the word anno. Now, you'll know the word anno for being the Latin for year. Anno Domini actually means to mark, to record. And annotation, the Latin there is annotere, which means to make marks explaining something or commenting on something. So when you annotate in a book, what you're doing is you're reading something and then you're passing your comment on how you understand it. That goes from passively listening to the author to actively talking with the author. When you have a conversation that's scintillating and titillates the brain and the intellect, you remember tons more about that conversation. And so it is that people who annotate will remember more from their books. For instance, I'll show you 2 books. This one and this one. Which one would you prefer on your shelf? Well, of course it's this one. It looks beautiful. It's got the gold leaf edging, all that kind of stuff. This one's all tatty and broken and dog-eared. But which of these books, or which reader do you think got the most out of their book? Hands down, this one, okay? Now, isn't that who you want to be? So if you're scared of annotating, stop it. Books are to be enjoyed and experienced. Annotation brings you into a direct conversation with the author. Don't do it in an expensive book. Get a cheap book and annotate. You will begin to remember loads more. The second really powerful piece of advice that will help you to remember more of what you read takes a bit of patience and a bit of effort at times. In fact, we all think we do this, and yet most of the time we don't do it very well. And it's this: take the time to think about what you've read. Now again, don't just skip to the next tip thinking you know what that means. Let's look at it a bit more deeply, get the real gold. When you think, it enables you to visualize much more distinctly. When you think about something, you can start making associations and connections between the thing you're reading and things you've experienced in your own life. Even if that's a novel set in the medieval ages, you'll find connections in emotions and ideas and temperaments. Sometimes thinking will give you a breakthrough moment of discernment, understanding something more clearly. Now, all of those things are anchors for the memory. When we see something clearly, when we make a connection with our own life and something, the mind will hold on to it much more readily. We're not talking here about spending hours and hours thinking over a chapter that you've read. Rather, just taking a brief pause, a small hiatus in your reading to go over some of the things you've read, to get up and make a coffee or a tea or whatever is your beverage of choice, and while you're doing it, reflect on what you've just read. You can ask yourself things like, what was the story I just read? How many points in the chapter can I bring out? What new characters are there? Can I try and remember their names? Just the act of trying engages the mind more and will force it to remember more. Thinking is the hardest thing to do, which is why so few people really do it well. That's a famous quote. And we may think we've got our thoughts on the book quite clearly, but you know, when you ask someone to express their thoughts, it's full of fuzzy ideas, and that demonstrates that the thinking is not clear. When your thinking's clear, you can express it very clearly. So what kind of things will help you to think about the book? Well, I've got a few on screen. Try and recall events or characters that you've just read and associate them with characters you know in real life or places you remember from your experience in life. Ask yourself, where is the story going? Try and preempt where the author is taking this, because it gets you into the story. It makes you a citizen of the pages, as I like to say. Ask yourself, what idea do I sense the author is exploring? Now, if it's genre fiction, that may not be something that's being done, but the classics tend to have an exploration, for instance, of an idea. Non-fiction, certainly. Try and see the author's perspective. Do you get an inclination of how they feel about what they're talking about? Just one more thing on the power of thinking and remembering is a small exercise I remember doing at school. And we were given 10 words that we had to memorize, and we had 60 seconds to memorize them, and how many could we recall? Now, some were better than others, but it was a struggle. Then we were given 10 other words in a list which came with a picture. Guess which ones were remembered the most. It was the ones where you had the words and the pictures. When you take the time to think, to pause and just walk away and think over what you've read, maybe a few chapters, you will embed it more in your mind and you'll find it easier to recall later. The third piece of advice is the crown jewel amongst these 5. And when you start doing it, it doesn't take long before you get the payoff. And that is writing. Writing is the best way to remember things and to get more out of them, to connect, because it's a physical act. When you write with your hand, your mind engages very exclusively in the activity, unlike when you're just thinking about it. I want to put it this way. If annotating is like a sketch that an artist has of a building, thinking is the architectural plan. Writing is the building of the edifice. It becomes real, it becomes concrete. You can't be hazy when you're writing. You never use ums and ers. You have to try and find your exact expressions. So what are some ideas and ways to write about the book that you're reading? Well, I'm going to give you a few now, But wait for the last one because it's one that not many think of. So, things you could write about. First of all, you could do either a character analysis of the main character or the antagonist, how you feel they've been drawn, what you like about the way they present themselves. Do you sense that they've got certain weaknesses in their character? Another way of doing this is to make a short 3-word description of each character you come across. Whether that word be a quality or a physical attribute, just write them down and see how they change through the book. Another thing I would highly recommend you write is a chapter summary, or at least a 5-chapter summary, where you nail down what you think are the most important elements of what you've just read, where you track how the story is developing, where you even guess what characters are going to do, how they're going to influence each other. Just writing that down makes you visualize, and it embeds the idea in your memory. It also gets so much more out of your reading. You become so much more invested and immersed in the experience. Something I highly recommend you do is to do a 500 to 1,000 word review of the book. I don't necessarily mean a Goodreads review. I just mean, what did you like about the book? What did you dislike about the book? Who stood out for you? Who could have been improved? What was the underlying message? What were the tropes used? What were the themes? Whatever stands out to you, flick back through your annotations and start seeing your comments on certain paragraphs, and then write up a short review of the book. This, I can't explain how amazing this is on your memory and your ability to speak about it in a way that others will think, wow, I wish I could speak like that about the books I read. Now, the last thing I'm going to suggest is to do with the kind of pen you use. When I talked about annotation, I said just grab a cheap pen and a cheap book because you're in the sketchy mode, okay? But when you're writing, use a quality pen. The psychological impact of using a good pen with a nice bit of heft is tremendous. It makes you take your writing more seriously. Now, that segues quite nicely into this pen. This is the one I use. It's by Bastion Pens, and they did send this to me, but I've been using it a while before recording a video because I always like to use a very good quality pen, and this really does it. This one in particular is milled completely from a block of titanium, and that gives it a beautiful weight. It's a pleasure to hold it. You feel connected as soon as it's in your hand. It has a beautiful bolt action clip, which means it sets on and you're not going to knock it off. It holds firmly and it's got a real gravitas to it when you turn that. On top of that, it writes particularly smoothly. It comes in a beautiful package. Whenever I get it out, I know I'm about to do something important. It comes with a small carrying sleeve as well. But one of the things I particularly like about this pen that shows its quality is, where is the seam? You know when you come to change the cartridge, where is the seam on this? It is milled so finely that, well, I'll show you where the seam is. You can't even see it when it's closed. It's a quality pen. I cannot stress to you how much more beneficial your writing is, how much more seriously you take your thoughts when you sit down with a pen that's got a decent weight to it and write smoothly. The fourth piece of advice that would definitely help you to remember more of what you've read is really simple to do, and that is talk about what you're reading with others, whether they want to hear it or not, I might add. Back in the 90s, there was an idea to do with memory called graduated interval recall. So you gradually, at intervals, recall some aspect of what you've learned. And talking is the simplest way to do this. So, if you've got a partner or a spouse, tell them what you're reading. If they're washing up and they sort of may not even seem interested, you're doing it for your memory. What I will say is, as you further go through a book, if you keep doing this to them, they strangely enough will become interested because slowly they're hearing more and more. And the more you hear about something, the more interested you become. Another way is to read a book, if it's a novel, with someone. Either, like me and my wife, we often sit in bed and we'll read a chapter back and forth to each other. It makes it more of an experience, which means it's something you're going to remember and you will naturally talk about it with each other. Join a book club or create one with your friends, even if that's people who are in different countries and you do it via Zoom. Being able to talk through a book and share your ideas will make you remember it more. Or if you're in a book club that is online and they don't actually meet up, make sure you leave comments and comment on other people's comments. That simple act of doing something will embed your idea much more deeply. It sounds simple, but honestly, this works brilliantly. The fifth and final piece of advice comes with a fascinating bit of trivia. Do you know what the most interesting topic is to a person, other than themselves? It's whatever they already know something about. If you try and introduce somebody to a topic that they've never heard of or never shown an interest in, it's hard to get them going. But if you start talking about something they're familiar with, we love adding data on what we feel we already know. It actually helps us to remember it more. Now, with that in mind, the fifth piece of advice that will help you remember a book more is to read or watch something on that book after you've read it. Now, in novels, for instance, you often have introductions, which I don't particularly read before I read the story because I don't want any spoilers, but I will read them afterwards because in an introduction, someone has found out maybe some background details of the author that has influenced parts of the book, or there may be some link between other pieces of literature which you've never read before, and it just brings the book to more life. Alternatively, come online and watch on YouTube a good book review. And by a good book review, I don't mean like, oh, I like this, book. I love the way the cover looks, and not like that. They're valuable reviews in their own way. But where someone really talks about the themes and ideas that they felt were in the book, the quotes that stood out to them. Because if you haven't got someone to talk to straight away, at least listen to someone talk about it. It will embed the idea. It will give you a deeper appreciation of the things you've just read. And of course, when you appreciate more, appreciation is an emotion. Emotions make you remember. Well, for those of you who made it all the way through this without skipping tip to tip, I congratulate you. You have the mentality it takes to become a really good reader. Now, the 5 pieces of advice that I've shared with you are all powerful. If you practice one of them and practice it every time you read, you will double or even triple the amount you can eventually remember in books. On top of that, you'll be able to speak more intelligently, more eloquently about what you've read, to the point people will notice and think, I wish I could get that much out of it. It's because you're putting in the effort and others are not. Now, you don't have to do all 5 of these if you haven't done any of them before. I would suggest starting with annotation. Once you annotate a book fully, it doesn't have to be extensive annotation, but once you've annotated, you'll be convinced that it's the right way to read. If you've enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because when you press that bell, it will alert you to the videos I release, and upcoming is a video on why people don't remember what they've read, and a video on how I annotate a book to give you ideas of what you can and what you don't need to do when you're annotating. How to make annotation excite you rather than make it some scholastic chore which robs all the joy of reading. That's not the point of annotation. You want to converse with the author. Until the next time I see you, I wish you joy in whatever you read.